Richard III is one of the most controversial figures in English or British history. Even today, more than 500 years after his death at the Battle of Bosworth, he can divide opinion as passionately as he did in life. But why is it that the evidence that we have can be read so differently to create such polarised versions of the same man? This is the story, or rather one version of the story, of King Richard III. Richard was born on the 2nd of October 1452 at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire, the family seat of the House of York. He was the youngest child to survive infancy of Richard, 3rd Duke of York, and his wife Cecily Neville. Richard had 3 older brothers and 3 older sisters who'd survived infancy. Anne was 13, Edward was 10, Edmund 9, and Elizabeth 8. Edward and Edmund were already installed in their own household at Ludlow Castle. Anne was married to Henry Holland, 3rd Duke of Exeter. Elizabeth was soon to become a Duchess too, marrying John de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. Closer in age to Richard and his companions in the Yorkist nursery at Fotheringay were Margaret, aged 6, and George, who was almost 3. Both were to play a significant role in Richard's life, and the firm bonds between them began to be forged in these earliest years. Richard was born into a kingdom on the very brink of war with itself. His father had served as Lieutenant General in the English holdings in France, won by Henry V, and clung to against increasing odds since his death in 1422 had left his 9-month-old son on the throne as Henry VI. Amid growing suspicion, which is hard to explain, York lost the post in France and was transferred to Ireland. This wariness must have been at least in part because of York's maternal bloodline. Although his father was descended from the royal House of York via the 4th son of Edward III, his mother was Anne Mortimer. The Mortimer family had been one of the most important, influential and wealthy in England during the 14th century. The male line had died out though in 1425 with the death of York's maternal uncle, Edmund Mortimer, 5th Earl of March. But the wealth had passed wholesale to York. Edmund and Anne were descended from Lionel, Duke of Clarence, the second son of Edward III. The problem was that Henry VI and the House of Lancaster traced their lineage to Edward's 3rd son, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. To some, the Mortimer claim to the throne appeared to be better than the Lancastrian claim. Now all of that possibility was tightly focused on York, making him a man the Lancastrian regime feared, despite his loyal service. In 1450, while York was in Ireland, a man named Jack Cade led a huge number of Kentish men into London and held the city. The king and court scurried away to the Midlands, both encouraging the rebels who wanted some of the king's ministers removed and leaving the capital feeling abandoned. When Cade decided to give his real name as John Mortimer, it only added fuel to the fire, and the rebels' insistence that York should be given a central role in government, alongside the use of the Mortimer name, made it worse. Although the revolt was quashed, York was left in a worse position than ever before, with mounting suspicion that he had instigated the rebellion. The problems seemed amplified for as long as Henry remained childless and York's brood went from strength to strength in stark comparison. In early 1452, York led a force to Dartford, just south of London, in an effort to impose himself on the king, to win the position of influence that he and many others believed his status deserved. A delegation from the king asked York for his demands. He insisted that Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, Henry's chief adviser and York's nemesis, be arrested and face charges of treason. Henry agreed, and York disbanded his army, but when the Duke went before the king, he found Somerset still very definitely in place, and himself a captive. Forced to swear a humiliating oath at St Paul's Cathedral, York slunk back to his fortress at Ludlow on the Welsh borders. It was into this complex and edgy situation that our Richard was born in October of that same year. A country all set to tear itself apart, poised, full of tension, on the very brink of civil war. Richard emerges dramatically onto the political scene in the autumn of 1459 on the Welsh borders, at his father's castle in Ludlow. The situation in England had deteriorated into viciously polarised factions. York and Somerset had finally come to blows over the right to stand at the king's side in 1455. At the First Battle of St Albans, Somerset was killed in the streets of the town, along with Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, and Thomas, Lord Clifford. Humphrey Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, and even the king himself were injured in the fighting. This is where Shakespeare's Richard makes his first appearance, killing Somerset, when in reality he was a toddler of 2. York took control of the government, but it didn't last long before he was isolated again, this time with a young batch of nobles baying for his blood in revenge for their father's deaths at St Albans. Henry Beaufort, the new Duke of Somerset, had been injured in the battle, and he, the new Earl of Northumberland, and the young Lord Clifford would not be placated, even when Henry organised a love day to try and put the matter to bed. It just didn't work. The mood was summed up by one chronicler, who wrote that, "In this time the realm of England was out of all good governance, as it had been many days before. The king was simple and led by covetous counsel, and owed more than he was worth. His debts increased daily, but payment was there none. All the possessions and lordships that pertained to the crown the king had given away, some to lords and some to other simple persons, so that he had almost naught to live on." Plenty were clear who they singled out for blame in all of this. Another chronicler complained that the governance of the realm stood most by the queen and her council, so that the great princes of the land were not called to council, but set apart. By 1459, a tense Cold War had settled on England. York began to muster those who took his side at Ludlow, including his wife's powerful family. Cecily's brother was Richard Neville, Earl of Salisbury, the head of the large Neville clan, which, butting up against the Percy Earls of Northumberland, controlled huge chunks of the north of England. Salisbury's oldest son was his namesake, the Earl of Warwick, who would be nicknamed the Kingmaker much later on. As Salisbury moved south to join York, he met an army raised by the Queen in the name of her son, Edward, Prince of Wales, but he was victorious at the Battle of Blore Heath and reached Ludlow, where his son soon arrived from Calais with that town's garrison. York decided during the ramping up of these tensions that Fotheringay was no longer safe for Cecily, Margaret, George and Richard, and had them brought to Ludlow. Richard passed his 7th birthday on the 2nd of October, watching the town swell and buzz as an army gathered. Supplies were packed into the town, and the castle hummed with activity as men practised at arms. This is the first time that we can place all the 4 sons of York, Edward, Edmund, George and Richard, all together. Quite what Richard made of Edward, already 17, 6 foot 4 inches tall, and soon to prove himself a juggernaut on the battlefield, can only be imagined, but the little boy may well have developed something of a hero complex about his oldest brother in these days. At the very least, he saw what he hoped he might one day become. A few days after Richard's birthday, York led his host out of Ludlow, heading south to Worcester before turning east towards London, probably aiming to repeat his actions at Dartford 7 years earlier. A few days later, though, the army returned in something of a panic. As they'd left Worcester, news had arrived that King Henry himself was at the head of an army almost twice their size, flying the royal banners and bristling for a fight. York was followed all the way back to Ludlow. As they waited for the king's army to arrive, his men dug defensive earthworks at Ludford Meadows just outside the town. During the night of the 12th of October, the Calais garrison, brought by Warwick, scaled the defences and fled into the king's pardon, securing their wages from the crown, but also taking with them details of the Yorkists' defences and plans. As the situation changed, York, Edward, Edmund, Salisbury and Warwick retired to the castle for a late-night council of war. When dawn broke on the 13th of October, the army looked around in bemused uncertainty. Their leaders were nowhere to be found. The nobles had slipped out of the castle under cover of dark, and York and Edmund would soon be in Ireland, with Edward, Salisbury and Warwick making for Calais. But what did all this have to do with Richard? Well, he was left behind. Not quite in a Home Alone booby-trapping the castle kind of way, though that'd be a great story. When the men ran, they left Cecily, Margaret, George and Richard behind them. York's army surrendered to the king and was pardoned. Ludlow was sacked as though it was a captured French town, punished for supporting its lord. One London merchant recorded that in the reckless chaos that ensued, men went wet-shod in wine, and then they robbed the town and bore away bedding, cloth and other stuff, and defiled many women. A later legend sprang up that Duchess Cecily bravely stood at the town's market cross, her children beside her, to meet the marauding royal army. There's no contemporary evidence of this, but the castle was also ransacked and looted, and the 7-year-old Richard was caught in the midst of this terrifying scene. Doubtless his father, brothers, uncle and cousin had believed that Cecily and her young children would be protected by her sex and their ages. They were proven right. Henry made it clear that Cecily and the little ones were innocent and had caused him no offence. But a 7-year-old boy can hardly have seen the logic clearly in the screaming and commotion of an army sacking the town that had so recently seemed an exciting place to be, and the castle he had been brought to for his protection. Richard, with his mother and siblings, was placed into the care of the Duchess of Buckingham, who was one of Cecily's sisters. It's almost impossible that this episode failed to leave a mark on Richard. He'd seen at a young age just how quickly apparent security could be whipped away, and how fast fortune's wheel, a favourite medieval metaphor for the rising and falling of fortune, could really spin. York and his family were attainted for treason, stripped of all their lands and titles. Richard remained in his aunt's household with his mother, his sister Margaret, and his brother George. King Henry provided for them generously, but their family was ruined. The Yorkist lords in exile were busy though. On the 26th of June 1460, Edward, Salisbury and Warwick landed at Sandwich. On the 10th of July, they met the king's forces at the Battle of Northampton. In the pouring rain, the royal guns failed. Lord Grey betrayed the king and opened the defences to Edward. Henry was captured and returned to London. It wasn't until the second week of September that York himself returned from Ireland. When he did, he came flying royal banners with an unsheathed sword carried before him. He came as a king. At Westminster, York climbed to the throne on the dais and laid a hand on it, claiming it for his own. He was met by a terrible silence. The ensuing deliberations in Parliament resulted in the Act of Accord. York's superior claim through his Mortimer line was recognised, but there was no will to depose the hapless but inoffensive Henry. He would remain king for the rest of his life, but York and his family would be heirs to the throne, not Henry's own son. From a disinherited boy, Richard had suddenly become son of the heir to the throne. Fortune wasn't done with him yet, though. On the 30th of December, York and his second son Edmund were killed at the Battle of Wakefield, fighting an army gathered by an outraged queen to protect her son's future. Margaret had secured a Scottish army with the promise of English plunder, and it struck fear into the country as they headed south, eventually proving counterproductive. By the 5th of January 1461, news of her husband and son's deaths had reached Cecily in London. On the 2nd of February, Edward vented his rage on an army heading out of Wales led by Jasper Tudor, crushing them at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. A fortnight later, Warwick blocked the Queen's army in its path south at St Albans, 6 years after the last battle there. Now, it was Warwick's turn to taste defeat. He fled west towards Edward, leaving London dangerously exposed. Duchess Cecily's response was a measure of just how much the situation in England had changed in a year. At Ludlow, all had felt comfortable that a wife and young children would be spared any blame. Now, as Queen Margaret's army approached, all such certainty was gone. York had made his children the legal heirs to the throne. With his and Edmund's deaths, Edward was heir, George was second in line, and Richard third. Cecily must have feared that Margaret meant to wipe out all threats, however young and innocent. The boys were first hidden in London with a widow named Alice Martin. By the spring of 1461, Cecily was too scared even to risk this. George, now 11, and Richard, who was 8, were put into a small boat with a few trusted men and sailed away from their mother, London and England, landing in Burgundy. The sprawling territories of the Duke of Burgundy were a far from certain haven for the York boys. For Duke Philip the Good, the arrival of two such contentious but helpless lads caused him a quandary. Harbouring them risked incurring the wrath of France, but ill-treating them wasn't only dishonourable, but if their brother should prevail, it would be difficult to explain to him why Philip had been less than hospitable. The Duke's solution was to make them comfortable, but keep them at arm's length, in Utrecht, away from his court. After weeks of what must have been nervous seclusion, George and Richard were suddenly swept to Duke Philip's court at Bruges to receive the bewildering news that their brother had been proclaimed King Edward IV. He defeated the Lancastrian forces at the epic Battle of Towton, and he wanted his brothers home for his coronation. George was now heir to his childless brother's throne, and Richard was second in line. Their uncertain exile was brought to an end, but they must have wondered as they set sail for England just how long this spell of good fortune might last. On Friday the 26th of April 1461, the spectacle of Edward IV's coronation began. The following day saw George and Richard created Knights of the Bath by their brother. With 26 other new members of this order of chivalry, George and Richard led their big brother into Westminster Abbey on Sunday the 28th of April for his coronation ceremony. The day after the coronation, George was created Duke of Clarence, a title based on the honour of Clare that had come to the York family as part of the Mortimer inheritance. It wasn't until the 1st of November that Richard was given the title Duke of Gloucester. The Clarence title had previously belonged to Lionel, the second son of Edward III, through whom the Mortimers traced their descent, and Gloucester had belonged to that king's youngest son, Thomas. It fed the Yorkist propaganda effort to have York seen as king by right. He should have been king, so now his oldest son was. The second surviving son was Duke of Clarence, and the youngest was Duke of Gloucester. The Lancastrians had done the same. Henry IV's second son was Duke of Clarence, and his youngest Duke of Gloucester. Edward was making it plain that the Yorkist dynasty was here, it was legitimate, and it was permanent. Richard, George and Margaret were installed at the Palace of Pleasance in Greenwich. Rather than giving them vast tracts of land, Edward began to give his brothers offices of national importance to help prepare them for their future role in his regime. George was made Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, and Richard was appointed Admiral of England, Ireland and Aquitaine. To give him some landed authority, Richard was also given the castle and honour of Gloucester to go with his dukedom, and the same in Richmond, which had belonged to Edmund Tudor and was now claimed by his son Henry Tudor. He also received the castle and lordship of Pembroke from Jasper Tudor, and the constableship of Corfe Castle that had been the Duke of Somerset's. A scattering of other properties across Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Suffolk, Essex, Northamptonshire, Rutland and Kent that had belonged to the attainted Earl of Oxford kept him well provided for, but without a solid block of land. George and Richard were kept in London, a mark of their importance to Edward's new regime. They were placed into the care of several key men in the following years, including Thomas Lord Stanley and Thomas Bourchier, Archbishop of Canterbury. Edward, though, took special interest in his little brothers and visited them almost every day, cementing the admiration Richard might have felt for him as he became something like a father figure to the bewildered little boy. It wasn't to last, though. George was the king's heir for the moment, but Richard wasn't, and his immediate future lay elsewhere. It was a move that would, whether anyone realised it or not, define the rest of his life.